You'll give me a warning. Okay, great. Yes, thank you for the introduction and for the platform to talk about some of our very recent results. So I'm going to be talking about replica symmetry breaking in a cavity platform. And so this is work done in the group of Professor Benjamin Lev at Stanford. So to set the stage for this replica symmetry breaking, this is a concept in the context of spin glasses. So let me start by defining and introducing these systems. So the energetic description of these systems is very straightforward. We just need an Ising Hamiltonian. So with pairwise interactions. But the crucial key is that the Jij interactions strengths have disorder, and not only in their magnitude, but also their sign. So some interactions will be ferromagnetic and some will be anti-ferromagnetic. And it turns out that doing this for large-scale systems actually shows all kinds of interesting complex behavior that basically emerges out of this simple Hamiltonian. And for example, finding the ground state of these systems is computationally equivalent to solving many of these real-world quadratic optimization problems. And they all belong to a class of NP-hard problems. Now, fundamentally, the reason why this is so hard has to do with the concept of frustration. So here it's illustrated the geometric frustration, a triangle of spins that can point up or down. And the bonds here are, these two bonds are ferromagnetic and this one is anti-ferromagnetic. You can simply see you cannot satisfy all bonds at the same time. Now for this simple system, small system, we can enumerate all states, but once this grows to a very large system, the energy landscape becomes very complex. And this, try to illustrate here in the bottom left, of course the Hilbert space is high dimensional, but it has lots of local minima. And so here it's actually a little bit tricky to figure out which of these local minima is the ground state. And so that's basically what a spin glass is, but our understanding of it and describing it beyond this simple definition is actually quite tricky. And so Giorgio Parisi won the Nobel Prize a couple years ago for describing sort of the structure that these local minima have in a particular version of the spin glass, all-to-all infinite range. So that's where the stage is set. So let me go a little bit beyond the definition and tell you about how you can recognize a spin glass, what sets it apart. So for this, I take this canonical example of a Sherrington-Kirkpatrick model. It's the same Hamiltonian, it's just a particular name for the ensemble of J matrices. So they're sampled from a normal distribution with a controlled mean and variance scaled such that the thermodynamic limit made sense. And for this one, the phase diagram is known. So when the temperature is high, we have a paramagnetic phase. When the mean dominates, this is just a ferromagnet. But then when the variance is the dominant term of the Hamiltonian, then you get a spin glass phase. And so to tell this spin glass phase apart, we need an order parameter to describe it. So we know that the ferromagnet is described typically by magnetization. And for the spin glass phase, you can use something called the replica overlap. So here I just give the definitions. The magnetization is, as you know, just the sum over all spins. But for replica overlap, we have to think a little bit more. So the basic idea is we take two systems that have the same quench disorder and observe them. And you'll find that those systems will get stuck in different local minima in this energy landscape. So if we look at the instantaneous state, you'll find that two replicas can have different states. And so this overlap between the states you find is not one, basically. So with these two order parameters, we can then fill in this phase diagram. And to illustrate, this relates to the concept of non-ergodicity. So you explore, you really get stuck in these local minima. So just to give you a bit of intuition, for a ferromagnet, you can of course still calculate the overlap parameter because the states you'll find are either all up or all down. If I take two copies of the system, if I find in one system all up and the other also, the overlap is 1. or -1 if I find the Z2 symmetric state. Now, instead, if I look at a Glassy instance, you can see that in addition to these two peaks that you will basically always have, you'll also find peaks in the interior. So this is an example for a disorder instance that admitted two minima in the energy landscape. But the two minima are basically uncorrelated with each other, so they have practically zero overlap. And if we do this for another disorder instance, you get some other peaks. And so the sensible question here then is to ask, what is this if we average over all the disorder instances? And then you can see you get a smooth filling in of this overlap distribution with a sort of known curve. And so that's the key feature of a spin glass, and this is what's called replica symmetry breaking. So in this talk, I will tell you about how we study this on an experimental platform where we use a multi-mode confocal cavity. So I'll introduce that and then tell you about two very new results. One in theory, where we study the dynamics near the phase transition of this system, and then experimentally how we realize a vector version of this spin glass. So as I said, we use neutral atoms inside optical cavities, and we use this transverse pumping phase transition. So we shine laser light transversely to the atoms. Initially, they are in a BEC with a homogeneous density, more up to finite size effects. And then once the superradiant phase transition is reached, atoms scatter some of this pump light into the cavity. And the cavity light makes this optical potential that encourages the development of a density wave of the BEC. And so this has been discussed already a couple times this conference. You can observe this by looking at the light that comes out of the cavity. You'll see that there is a critical pump power for this transverse pump to really reach this threshold. Simultaneously, you can look at the atomic density distribution in time of flight and see the structure of this BEC. And so to understand this phase transition, there is a competition of energies. So normally creating this density wave costs kinetic energy. But this kinetic energy is overcome by the photon-mediated interaction between atoms. So atoms can interact with each other as mediated by the cavity. So that works and can be done in single-mode cavities. Now what we have pioneered in our group is multi-mode cavities. And so having multiple field modes that participate in this physics really brings complexity. And so here I show you an example, or this is transmission spectroscopy of our cavity, which we can tune in situ between multi-mode and single mode and really adjust the sort of photon-mediated interactions and thereby control the connectivity also. And so in addition to then looking at the time information of the light that leaks out of the cavity, we can also look at the spatial information that leaks out. And so we can do holographic techniques to fully reconstruct the electric field inside the cavity, so both the amplitude and the phase. And this will also tell us something about the phase of these density waves and the condensates within. So this is a picture of what that looked like before we installed a lot more optics. This is our cavity. It's about 1 centimeter in length inside a vacuum chamber where we can make ultra-cold gases, BECs of rubidium-87. So I should tell you what this multi-mode cavity does for you in detail, and we have a whole body of work on that. So to do that, we can start by thinking about ray tracing. What if I have an atom inside the cavity? What happens as it emits light? So this light can propagate through the cavity, and as we let the animation finish, we can see a particular pattern emerge. So wherever there is light, there's interactions, because this is a photon-mediated interaction. And so we can recognize that where the atom emitted light, the interaction is strong because the light is focused there. That leads to this local interaction term. There is another spot here across the cavity that also has a strong focus of light that leads to the mirror term. And I'll explain how these two diagonal arms then lead to this other interaction. Now this ray tracing picture can be understood from realizing that the particular cavity we use is a confocal cavity, where the length is equal to the radius of curvature. And a curved mirror with a radius of curvature r has a focal length of r over 2. So propagating from the midplane to the cavity mirror is exactly propagating by the focal distance. So the cavity, as you propagate from the middle to the mirror and get reflected, does a Fourier transform. And you can then see that these two terms, local plus mirror, if you take the Fourier transform of them, you get this kind of cosine interaction. Now, this was a simple ray tracing animation. If we go to actually the Gaussian picture of light and we calculate the electric field, you can see that these two crossing arms interfere and give a light field that has an oscillatory pattern. And so again, that's why you get this cosine interaction. Now, and so this we can all see, as I said, by imaging the light that comes out of the cavity. So we can recognize the two spots, and here in the background, you can see that there is, on the screen a little bit faint, but a non-local field. And so we've previously characterized this interaction, that this interaction length scale C can be really short, of the scale of 2 microns. This sets both the interaction range and the resolution for sort of imaging what is happening inside the cavity. So this is, in a sense, a quantum gas microscope, but in an active one. The light both reveals the information as well as mediates the interactions. And as a side note, then the interaction strengths, characterized by the cooperativity, which in the single mode configuration for us is 5, get boosted by this multi-mode interference. Now, this non-local interaction is interesting because it's sign changing in nature. This cosine can be both positive and negative. And so that's exactly what we can then use to study spin glass physics, where we need this order in the signs. And it's also, in a way, programmable because we can control it by the position of atoms inside the cavity, which we can control with optical tweezers. The other ingredient we need to really study spin glasses is a spin degree of freedom. This can be done by coupling two internal states of the rubidium atom. And after eliminating the cavity field, you find that this realizes an effective Ising model, a transverse field Ising model, where this Jij is exactly set by this non-local interaction. So this is then the ingredients for simulating spin glasses. So here is a rendering of what that could look like. The green spots here are the atoms we put inside the cavity. We use a transverse pump, and the light that leaks out of the cavity here in blue is collected in this interference measurement that reveals us the information about what's going on inside the cavity. So just thinking about this Jij matrix, instead of, this is not drawn from a normal distribution, but we've also previously studied and shown that there is both a ferromagnetic phase as well as a spin glass phase and some phase in between that you can see in addition to the paramagnet. So that's just statics. Now I want to say something about the dynamics, because the cavity is inherently an open quantum system. Light that bounces around will leak out. And so this is then sort of sets the stage for driven-dissipative dynamics. As I mentioned, there is the superradiant phase transition. So when the spins start in the down state, which is the lowest energy state without the Ising interaction, as we ramp up the transverse pump, they organize into the X basis, either left or right. So far above the superradiant phase transition, we've previously shown that there's already interesting dynamics here that happens due to the dissipation. So the cavity can realize steepest descent dynamics through this spin energy landscape, where it flips the spin that gains the most energy. That's far above the threshold, and now I want to think about what happens near that phase transition, because this is where quantum fluctuations of the cavity fields really play an important role. So then you can ask, what are the effective dynamics of the system as we go through this phase transition? And what's the role of entanglement there? So this we now have approached with numerical simulations of reasonably small but reasonably sized systems. So this is an example of a 15-node graph that we can implement in our cavity. And I'll tell you now about what those some answers to these questions. So to efficiently simulate that, we have to do a little bit of math first. So the system is described by a multi-mode Dickey model, where each cavity field mode is described by a bosonic operator. The spins are described by SZ terms, and then there is an interaction between the spins and the cavity field with a strength G. Now, because we have many modes, we definitely don't want to keep track of all these bosonic fields. So we can try to eliminate them and get to an atom-only description. Now, because the dissipation happens only in the cavity field, we have to be a bit careful not to throw out all the interesting dissipative dynamics as well. So we do this via generalization of this paper that shows that you can retain the interesting dynamics. We end up with an atom-only master equation with collapse operators that act collectively on all spins at the same time. And also those collapse operators have slightly non-Hermitian character due to the dissipation. Then we can unravel this master equation and really look at the evolution of quantum states. And here I show you an example of one of these trajectories. So in the bottom here is the pump schedule. We turn up this transverse pump and take it through the superradiant phase transition. At the same time, we ramp down this field term. It turns out having this be zero at the end is a bit nicer for making the dynamics converge. So looking at only the x component, we can see in the normal phase, when the spin is still on the south pole, you don't get any average x component. But then as you ramp into the superradiant phase transition, the spins pick up an x, either plus or minus 1. And here you can see an example of some spins decided to still flip their pointing along x. So this is visually a bit better represented on a Bloch sphere, where we can see that the effective dynamics starts all the spins on the south pole, then goes into the interior of the Bloch sphere and pops out to the sides. This is in stark contrast with semi-classical dynamics, which just run around circles here and stay on the surface of the Bloch sphere. So the fact that this quantum state went to the interior of the Bloch sphere implies that there is entanglement that arose as we went through this phase transition. So because we have access to the full quantum state as we did this trajectory, we can also calculate the entanglement entropy. So here we show the entanglement entropy between each individual spin and the rest of the system, and see that as we go through the phase transition, this picks up. And then at later times, there is a revival here that has to do with the spin flip that we saw earlier. So this is a single trajectory. To see that this is robust, we can repeat this for various noise instances and average it and see that, yes, indeed, the entropy remains no matter how sort of the particular trajectory the system took. So next so there is entanglement, and then we can ask what does this mean for the dynamics of the system, for example, in terms of energetics. So to set the stage there, I show here the instantaneous, or the expectation value of the energy compared to the instantaneous ground state. And here I show again the semi-classical dynamics. This shaded region shows a region where entanglement is required. And so because this is semi-classical, you cannot enter into this barrier, and the dynamics necessarily ends up at high energy. If I now show this for the quantum trajectories, I really have to zoom in to the bottom here, where the scale is much smaller, and these quantum trajectories, by having this entanglement, can tunnel through this barrier and remain at low energies. And then at long timescales, as we saw in the previous slides, the dissipation actually projects you out into an Ising state. So in the middle of the trajectory here, as we were going through the phase transition, you're entangled, but you end up with a pure state. So the entanglement here plays an important role in remaining in the low energy states of these spin glasses. And ultimately we find the eigenstate. Now we can ask, if we do this for different noise realizations, we have a whole ensemble of states. What are the properties of this ensemble of states? Do they, for example, have some overlap distribution that is non-trivial? So to do that, we look at an ensemble of 200 trajectories which form our replicas. We can take pairwise overlaps and look at the distribution. So at early times, because the spins are still on the south pole, you basically get random answers, and random answers are orthogonal. We find an overlap that is basically 0. But then as the system evolves and goes through this phase transition and ultimately stabilizes at long times, we find an overlap distribution that has the two posts at plus and minus 1, but also features in the middle. Now, to understand these features, this was for a 15-clump system, we can still enumerate all the states and look at the local minima. And we can find that this system had 6 local minima. 3 of them here in orange have very low energy, and the other 3 have higher energy. And so we can see that if from the 200 trajectories we found, about 50% were in this first local minimum, which is the ground state. The other trajectories mostly were in the local minimas 2 and 3. And so if we then think about if I have 2 replicas and drawing from local minima 1, 2, and 3, you can then see that if you draw this, the first replica finds local minimum 1, the other local minimum 2, we get this peak because we can simply calculate the overlap of those 2 states. So we can identify then each of the peaks here with the local minima that we know the energy structure energy landscape has. Of course, we can also compare this to a Monte Carlo simulation at finite temperature, and we find that the best match temperature is about 10% of the spin glass transition temperature, so this is a cold system. But you can also see that this Monte Carlo distribution in red here doesn't match precisely all the details of the ensemble of states we found. So this hints at the ensemble being a non-thermal distribution. Of course, this is not entirely surprising. We have this complicated system with driven-dissipative dynamics. It's not a given you're going to find a perfect thermal distribution. So in addition to this overlap distribution, I also want to flash quickly the matrix of distances between individual replicas, where you can really see, as function of time, also a structure emerge. And I didn't really have time to discuss this, but the structure of local minima in spin glasses has a very particular tree-like structure. And this is called ultrametricity. And these matrices that are sort of this block-like structure is very reminiscent of that. So this, as far as I've shown now, was all for a single disorder instance J. So now we can repeat this for different disorder instances. So for different disorder instances, we will find different overlap distributions. And then, as we repeat this enough, if we take an average over disorder instances, we find that the system really shows this Parisi-like distribution with the goalposts and smoothly filled in interior. So again, we can compare this to a finite temperature Monte Carlo. The best fit temperature is pretty much the same. Again, we see that the red lines don't fully match the found ensemble, and again, this shows that it's a non-thermal distribution. Now, as you might remember, the spin glass phase was set apart by having non-zero overlap, but 0 magnetization. So for completeness, I shall also show you the magnetization, and this is centered around 0. This is, again, showing in red the thermal ensemble, what you would expect for this system. The width of this distribution would shrink as you make the system larger and larger. So this was for 15 spins. So what I've shown you now is that we can really see this replica symmetry breaking in this driven-dissipative system, that entanglement as you go through this phase transition, the superradiant phase transition, helps you find low energy states, that dissipation lets this replica symmetry breaking emerge as you follow the dynamics, and that we find a Parisi-like distribution. So that was all theory and numerical simulations. Now we want to switch to the experiment. So in the experiment, we don't exactly realize this Ising spin glass. Instead, we don't use this internal degree of freedom, but we go back to the picture of density waves. So each BEC now, each clump of atoms can form a density wave. And in a confocal cavity, this density wave actually can be at various locations along the cavity. So this really can pick any location that can be characterized by a spatial phase theta. Of course, there's also an amplitude of this density wave, and our effective model looks like this, where this term is a local interaction that just wants as much density wave as it can get within a clump, and this is an interaction between clumps where we actually care about this phase. Because this local interaction is quite a bit stronger than the non-local interaction, we can sort of optimize this by parts, set all the chi's to 1, and end up with this effective model. Now, I've written it out here in terms of the x and y components of these spins. And you can see that this lives in a 2D spin space, but the sign here is actually a little bit weird, because if this was Sx plus Sx plus Sy, this would be a xy, isotropic xy Hamiltonian. But here, because of the minus sign, it's actually an anisotropic xy Hamiltonian. So thinking a little bit about this model, we know that at high temperature, of course, it hosts a paramagnetic phase. It actually hosts 2 ferromagnetic phases. So one is when all the Jij elements are positive, then it's ferromagnetic in the spin x component. But if all the Jij elements are negative, it's actually ferromagnetic in the y component. And then when the Jij is sufficiently disordered, there is also a spin glass phase. And we are working on exactly mapping out the phase diagram here via parallel tempering. Thinking about the order parameters, because the spins are vectors now, the order parameters also get promoted a bit, so the magnetization also becomes a vector, and the overlap we can actually do component-wise and becomes a matrix. So the magnetization vector we can show on a 2D plot. I cannot visualize 2x2 matrices easily, so I'm only going to show you the diagonal elements, the overlap between the x components and the y components. And so this now is a numerical simulation of an ensemble of J matrices that shows zero magnetization and a smooth distribution of overlaps that has filled in this interior of what is now the relevant domain, this diamond. So that's the equivalent of the Parisi distribution for this system. Okay, so then we can go to the experiment and put 8 BECs inside the cavity. We can image through the cavity with the cavity acting as a microscope and see here 16 spots. That's just to remind you that this cavity always has a mirror image for each atom. So there are 8 BECs here on the right side. The cross here is the cavity center, and so the left half is just a mirror copy. From the positions we see here, we can calculate the J matrix. And this J matrix or graph I can show is fully connected. Now, because this actually is a XX minus YY Hamiltonian, the self terms also matter. That's why there are these loops. And this actually is a ferromagnet. Okay, it doesn't look like any of the ferromagnets I told you about. That's because it has a bit of hidden order. If I flip some of the spins from up to down the basis and make an according change in the J matrix, I can do this local gauge transformation that puts the J matrix into the form that really shows every element here is negative. And so this is a ferromagnet along the spin y direction. And so the energy landscape of the system is isomorphic to a ferromagnet. The technical term is that this is a one-component Matthes model. So this is just intensity imaging. Now I can switch on the local oscillator and do this holographic imaging where we reconstruct also the phase. And so here I show you the color wheel that represents the field. And zooming in on the 8 relevant BECs and doing a little bit of image processing to average phases, we can reconstruct the spin state that we found. And so we find here this particular configuration up, up, down, down. Of Of course, you have to remember that because you have to do a local gauge transformation to really show that this is a ferromagnet. If I do that here, I end up with this state, which kind of obviously is a ferromagnet. Now, what comes through less in these slides is actually the specific phase, and there can be slight defects away from the ferromagnetic ground state. We can assess these by calculating the energy of this state that we found. And repeating this experiment many times, making a histogram of the energies and comparing it to the ground state energy, so here I divide it by the magnitude, so the ground state here is at -1, we can find a distribution of energies, and from deriving the local density of states of these ferromagnets, we can fit this with a Maxwell-Boltzmann distribution, and find, again, that experimentally we find a temperature that is low compared to the relevant energy scales. And for completeness sake, I can show you the order parameters. So the magnetization of these states is along y. These are fully magnetized along y, so either +1 or -1. And the overlap distribution shows these two peaks. So if you generalize again from the Ising ferromagnet to this 2D ferromagnet, this is exactly what you would see. Just the two goalposts with nothing in the interior of the overlap distribution. So to see that, we're going to change the positions. We can program them in, get a different J matrix that is now corresponds to a Glassy instance. So again, we can do this imaging. I can clean up the state a little bit, and we see this state with 8 very different colors. This state has no obvious order and roughly 0 magnetization. So it corresponds to one of the local minima that we found that the energy landscape admits. Now, if we repeat this experiment, the same positions and the same ramping schedule, and observe again what comes out, we actually find another state. So these two are not the same. For example, these two colors are very different, whereas here they're close to the same. So this is now an example of this sort of replica symmetry breaking where two copies of the same experiment get stuck in different local minima. Now we can repeat this experiment more than twice, and showing here the outcomes of the experiment. So each spin is shown as we extract the phase of each spin, show different repetitions. This one is not so particularly instructive, but rather from this we can calculate the overlap distribution. And now we see this kind of shape. So again, we find 2 peaks here on the edges of this diamond. Those are corresponding to the goalposts of the distribution. But now we also find peaks in the interior. So these are the non-trivial overlap that this particular disorder instance admits. This is exactly what you expect to find if you do one disorder instance with replica symmetry breaking, where your system gets stuck in the different local minima. Now, what's interesting is that experimentally we can control the rate at which we ramp through this phase transition. So if we ramp slower through this phase transition and create, again, an overlap distribution, now we see that actually we only end up with these two, the peaks on the outside. The peaks in the interior have disappeared because in the experiment we actually no longer got trapped in other local minima. We simply only found the ground state. So this corresponds to a lower effective temperature that it's lower than the gap between the ground state and the first excited state. So this is quite interesting. Again, we can try to extract the effective temperature. This is well below the critical temperature for this for the glass transition. But we also have hints and signatures that it's not a thermal distribution again. Now, what's still in progress is repeating this for many disorder instances and seeing the smooth filling out of this diamond that will show us the Parisi-like distribution for this vector spin glass. Of course, there you have to take enough repetitions for enough J matrices. So this is a bit of a time-consuming process. But we at least have seen many of these that have peaks at different locations. This, of course, is more or less uncorrelated due to the local minima of the J matrix occurring at various locations in the configuration space. So that brings me to the end of the talk. Of course, I have to thank all the people that have contributed to this. So this, I think, has been Benjamin's dream for maybe 15 years already of realizing glasses in these optical cavities. So it's been really cool to see that come true. And that's work that I've done, of course, with lab mates. So Brandon has done most of the theory work. And then we have new lab members as well as longtime collaborators and, of course, funding agencies. So thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Where's the microphone?
Here.
Oh. Questions? Use this to be complete.
So with the network of interactions, how much control do you have in choosing that network, or is it just kind of moving things around and getting what you're given?
So experimentally, we can control the positions of the BCs inside the cavity. There are some constraints, like we cannot make them too close to each other because otherwise the BCs will merge. Because this is also trapped from the side, it means it imposes a rectilinear structure. So you saw on these that they always form like a grid here. Those are pretty much the only constraints. Of course, you cannot make them so far out that they run outside of the cavity. But the J-matrix, that form of the interaction, is sufficiently random that you can basically make whatever graph you want. This we've definitely, like, for large positions, these J matrices have the same statistics as completely random matrices. Yeah.
Right behind you.
Yeah, very nice. It's really great to see these multi-mode cavities to come to fruition. So what are the prospects of doing this with quantum spins?
Yeah, so these experiments were with classical spins because the density wave degree of freedom is massively populated. The theoretical work was on quantum spins, and we believe this is pretty readily accessible by using Rydberg blockade, for example. If I use Rydberg blockade, where within a clump it's blockaded, so I can only have one Rydberg per clump, then now the Rydberg degree of freedom is a spin-half system. And you can do this in a way that doesn't sacrifice too much of the coupling. In fact, the coupling is the same as the collectively enhanced coupling here, because you still get the collective enhancement from the blockade. So that's the most promising avenue, I think, for really realizing spin-half.
Wouldn't you also need to reduce the dissipation then?
No, actually, the simulations were done for the dissipation rate we have in the experiment. Mm-hmm. So that turns out to be not a problem. Of course, if the dissipation is way too high, then it kills all the entanglement before you really explore this low energy states. But that seems fine. I mean, all the theory was done with the experimental parameters. So.
Thank you. I think in the interest of time, join me in thanking Ronen for the beautiful work.